Oh my god, yeah. Yeah. Oh my god, Mary sister, Merry Christmas.
So if you want to place Matthias Corvinus Rex in today's scenario, we need to understand how he ruled Hungary back then, why he was so great, and also we need to understand the dump that happened after his fall.
This is a dump. I don't belong here, I just come up here.
And I also think that it's fair to argue that Hungary was on the wrong side of history since Corvinus' death.
Are you certain that's the right question? What's the right question?
Is there a right side?
Exactly.
And for us to understand this, I want you to look at this map. 1487, Corvinus was tagging hard after capturing Wiener Neustadt. His legendary Black Army was straight up a gigachat squad of 20k cavalry, split equally between heavy and light riders, with heavy cavalry ranking 15 forints for 3 months and the light ones getting 10 forints. The whole crew's pay for 3 months hit around 314k forints. Provisions, ammo and all the extra firepower were not even factored in. Meanwhile, the king's annual income was about 600k forints, meaning that his Black Army was literally burning through his cash. But Corvinus, instead of being dumb and a spendthrift, he was making a savvy, high-stake investment. So look, he wasn't just throwing money around, he was strategically leveling up his state. So this man revoked all taxes, renaming and tweaking them to nix all those lame exemptions. And of course he slapped extra taxes on the peasantry, which massively boosted the royal bank account. Plus every conquest brought in extra cash, through reparations, tributes and territories. Historians say he pushed Hungary's borders to the absolute max. During his Bohemian campaigns, he annexed Moravia, Silesia and Lusatia, even though he never snagged Prague, the true heart of Bohemia. Then in later wars with the Habsburgs, he pulled parts of Lower Austria, including Vienna and Styria. And his Balkan moves netted him crucial fortresses in Bosnia. Overall, his conquests stretched Hungary's borders to 325k square kilometers, making the empire's peak flex in the late 15th century. We can say that Corvinus turned Hungary into a tax farm, where everyone was paid in the sweat of his own people. Well, that's fair to say, but it's also rude, you know, he was making mega moves on the map, so you can throw shade at him. It's not fair, because not everybody's making mega moves. So anyways, is it possible to place an old school real monarch into new modern political system? I think it's not fair and it's not possible, but I'm just going to do it anyway. Let's see how he's doing in the 1998-2002 Hungary. Back then, Orbán's first squad was out there trying to navigate Hungary's glow up from a communist mess to a modern market vibe. And it was a heavy ride, with plenty of ups and downs, so here's a low-key rundown of the struggles back then. So Hungary was still switching gears from a centrally planned system to a free market. Sure, there was some growth and the budget got tighter, but unemployment and living standards did not level up as fast as everyone hoped so. Privatization and some restructuring were kinda hit uneven, and of course this led to the economy on not being fully renewed. So Orbán was leading a coalition with Fidesz and other smaller parties like the Smallholders and the Democratic Forum. But for real, they were always sus. Of course, they were always clashing over priorities and making super hard to pass new reforms. All that fighting ended up giving the people some major FOMO and set the stage for the big L in 2002. And of course, people back then had like massive expectations and got low results. After decades of communism, Hungary was expecting fast, epic transformation. While Orbán's crew did roll out some reforms, the pace was low-key and not as lit as everyone imagined, which even made public dissatisfaction even more extra. Damn, Luka's doing good on the Lakers. But there were things that Orbán nailed, did really good, but it was not enough sadly. So let's go through these things that he did quite well. And that's fiscal discipline. One major win was how the government got its fiscal act together. They slashed the budget deficit and even started cutting down the national debt. And that was a really good move considering the economic struggle that they were in. Oh, and of course, they also boosted national clout. Because in 1999, Orbán's team secured Hungary's spot in NATO. And of course, he was the one who laid the groundwork, so Hungary can join the EU in 2004. So these moves were major flexes that pushed Hungary into a Western club and boosted its global rep. Oh, and one thing that he also did really good, he modernized the whole state vibe. So they also put in work to upgrade state institutions and streamline public administration. Not the flashiest of changes, of course, but they helped to set up a competitive scene for smaller businesses and help a longer-term progress. And of course there are things that really did not work out for Orbán Viktor back in 1998 to 2002. So he had economic reforms that were too chill. Even though they were improvements, the economic glow-up was super gradual. Unemployment stayed high and growth was slower than the hype. So lots of folks felt like any-day life was not getting any better. And of course he had some coalition instability. The constant squabbling in the coalition made it tough to push through a unified, ambitious reform agenda. This internal chaos added to the public's overall vibe and dissatisfaction, and helped Orbán to a major loss in 2002. And after that came like 8 years of Gyurcsány Ferenc. So I'm going to play a video here where I'm letting him to summarize you his term.
There aren't many choices. There aren't, because we screwed it up. Not a little, a lot. No country in Europe has done such stupidity as we have. It can be explained. Obviously, we lied throughout the last 1.5 to 2 years. It was completely clear that what we were saying was not true. We have exceeded the country's capabilities to such an extent that we could not have imagined earlier that the Hungarian Socialist Party and the Liberals' joint governance would ever do this. And meanwhile, we did nothing for 4 years.
So in short, that was Gyurcsány's term. It was interesting. But you know what? Let's place Corvinus as Prime Minister of Hungary from 1998 to 2002. Let's just analyze it from a geopolitical perspective. So back in the day he dropped serious cash to modernize the military. So this is not an overnight flex, this is a long-term grind that he wants to make here. He would be all about strategic balancing, forming only the choices bilateral and regional partnerships, while giving the side eye to any supranational bullshit that might water down Hungary's autonomy. His moves will be totally pragmatic, sealing alliances that secure Hungary's borders and cash flow, while keeping the nation independent from both Eastern and Western clichés. So yes, it sounds great, but it's total bullshit. And I do not even know if this is what he would do. You know, I'm not a specialist in human nature, but I'm really good at pattern recognition. And I do not mean that I'm racist. Anyway, so in 1999's Hungary, it was a really hard time. They were trying to stabilize austerity measures like the Bakros package. And they had a budget deficit hovering around 5% of GDP. Military spending was like 1.43% of GDP back then, which was kinda low compared to NATO's 2% target. Given those fiscal constraints and the need to keep economy in check, Hungary wasn't exactly full of cash to boost its military presence. It was kind of impossible. So I do not think that Corvinus could do a modern black army or anything like this. It's total bullshit. So there's no way to find a solution for this problem back then. I mean, you were happy to live from day to day. I mean, it was impossible. So let's look at his economic policy and management. Imagine this, he's about to drop the dopest mega tax patch, naming it the tax flex. It sounds good. This is something I came up with. I'm 100% sure he wouldn't came up with a silly name like this. Anyways, let's go further. With a long-term plan to level up Hungary's money game. he'd be flexing his legendary rep for flattening feudal tax system by ditching that clunky, outdated setup and rolling out a sleek, tech-enabled tax system. So this is something that actually Estonia did back then. So this actually sounds great and really lowers the corruption. So this shuts down every loophole and widens the tax base, basically booting all feudal exemptions. So maybe it would be absolutely possible and Estonia did it, but could Hungary really do this? So yeah, Eastern Europe was always left on red when it came to big tech, while Western Europe was straight up booming. Eastern Europe did not really do that well. Simply we were the forgotten squad, and we are till this day. Like we never got that quality of life patch, never. So maybe Corvinus would fail to implement this tech-enabled tax flex, and this might lead to his failure in 2002. How would he be able to deal with that political drama crew that surrounded Orbán back then? I mean, that's a tough question, right? Well, there's a plan for that too. But it's a grind, won't happen overnight, and by the time he would manage to execute it, his mandate might come to an end. But here's a blueprint for this. So that inner autocrat in Corvinus would not let him to be that pluralistic EU slave that the EU wants him to be. At least that's what he's thinking, I think. I have no idea, but something like this. So he's an autocrat, okay? And he would come up with a plan. Basically, he'd build his inner circles with loyalists, bust out the sus elements, and drop executive orders or decrees that force the coalition to roll with his vision. Think of it like bypassing the vote by controlling the key players, co-opting the smaller parties with incentives, and maybe even playing a little bit of intimidation if needed. In other words, he'd centralize power by turning every decision-making stage into his own personal flex session, making it so that even if he didn't have the numbers on paper, his crew loyalty and his strategic decree game would have everyone operating on his terms. Sadly, and maybe not sadly, actually it's a good thing, this could not work. This would have no chance, no way. So there was no room for a leader like this back then. So back then the system was rigged so nobody can use the government as a personal flexing session. Plus the political scene in 1999 was full of pluralism and active civil society that would have called out all the shady power grabs like this. Media opposition, parties, and even Western institutions were all watching like hawks. So you couldn't do power moves like this. It was impossible, especially after communism. They would not let it. They were happy that they fought communism and stopped it spreading. So they would never let another autocrat back then, back then. After that, maybe 100%. Because any attempt to bypass democratic votes with executive decrees would have been a straight-up no-go, thanks to the system that was already designed to keep one autocrat from running the whole show. So let's see Orbán's second term, and boy, this is polarizing. That's from 2010 to 2014. Actually, he has like 5 terms, and yeah, I'm just going to analyze bit by bit all of them. So after an 8-year break following his tenure, Viktor Orbán returned to power in 2010. He was capitalizing on widespread dissatisfaction with the previous government during the economic downturn. So his Fidesz party won a decisive victory in the parliament because Gyurcsány's term was so bad that everybody voted for Orbán. And of course, this gave an immense majority for Fidesz. So this outcome granted Orbán a 2/3 majority in the parliament. And of course, this allowed him to implement reforms with like a really minor opposition. Of course, this is not about Orbán, but let's just see how would Corvinus do, because now he has a chance for full control. And that's really scary. So let's just see a modern Corvinus inheriting Orbán's position in 2010. I think that he would move equally or maybe even with more vigor on consolidating power. So Corvinus's autocratic traits in a modern guise would drive him to exploit the 2/3 fully. For instance, ensuring powerful executive or even symbolically restoring elements of monarchic authority. For example, creating a strong presidential role for himself. His historical disdain for feudal checks and balances suggests that he would likely seek to neutralize modern power centers. The Constitutional Court, autonomous regulatory agencies, and of course, local government. So this would happen either by legal forms or placing loyalists in charge. So we can definitely imagine Corvinus in his 2010 mandate to heavily and aggressively centralize power. For example, appointing judicial commissars to oversee courts. Let's just check on his economic policy. What would Corvinus do? Orbán introduced unorthodox policies like special taxes on banks and foreign corporations, nationalization of private pension funds to regain fiscal control and facts of IMF oversight. And now we can get to Corvinus. So he, in that specific modern setting, renowned for squeezing nobles to found his army, would similarly prioritize sovereignty over orthodoxy. He might not care about extraordinary taxes on multinational firms. That's basically today's equivalent of wealthy barons, so this would help to stabilize finances and fund popular measures, all by portraying it as asserting Hungary's self-determination. So Orbán's early economic nationalism, for instance nationalizing 40 billions in pensions, would likely to be echoed by Corvinus, who would not hesitate to sacrifice elite interests for state coffers. But however, Matthias was also a patron of development. He might channel funds into grand infrastructure or cultural projects to glorify the nation. Maybe much as Orbán launched massive stadium projects. Look, to be honest, this can boost employment and loyalty. Good. Now let's look at media and propaganda. So Corvinus in his time actually controlled the narrative through royal decrees and court historians. Now, I think that he would likely find 21st century media manipulation really important. So as his mandate starts in 2010, he can accelerate the takeover over the media. Rather than relying on friendly oligarchs, he might consider direct state control or nationalization of major broadcasters. Of course, this happens in national interest. Propaganda under Corvinus would be heavy on national glory, invoking Hungary's medieval golden age. We might see state media praising the new leader as savior, reviving Hungary's past greatness. Akin to his folk image as Matthias the Just, he might stage publicize acts of justice, for example, spotlighting the prosecution of corrupt former officials or business oligarchs, to showcase his fairness, of course. And of course, this populist propaganda helps him a lot. Okay, so let's just see the constitutional changes that he would make. Orbán leveraged the 2010-2014 term to rewrite fundamental rules, removing the need of broad consensus and entrenching Fidesz's advantage. Corvinus, with his autocratic mindset, would have eagerly done the same. He would use two-thirds supermajority as a blank check to remake the state in his image. Historically, Matthias was opportunistic in accumulating titles. He even occupied Vienna and entitled himself as Duke of Austria. So, in modern context, he might not declare himself as king, of course. For instance, he might amend the constitution to appoint the prime minister as executive president, or maybe head of state, perhaps extending term lengths or removing time limits maybe. Sounds familiar. Orbán's government renamed the country from Republic of Hungary to just Hungary, and pegged the constitution with conservative social values. Not a problem for me. I'm some kind of a conservative myself, not like Donald Trump, so do not get me wrong here. And I think that Corvinus might insert more personal or nationalist elements here. So yeah, basically in the second term he would go nuts. So let's just get to the third term of Corvinus. So a re-elected Orbán faced a lot of criticism from the EU, and of course had a really weakening economy in its early years. And by the mid-decade we got a migration crisis that shook the whole continent of Europe. So yeah, this is a really interesting mandate that we are getting into. So let's see how Corvinus does. I personally think that modern Corvinus entering the third term would double down on power expansion and personal rule, taking the challenges with a mix of medieval ruthlessness and modern savvy. By 2014, having laid autocratic groundwork, he would feel emboldened to assert a grand vision. We could expect Prime Minister Corvinus to articulate a vision of Hungary as 21st century kingdom in spirit, a proudly illiberal, sovereign democracy that rejects Western liberal decadence. which maybe it's not that bad. He might explicitly invoke Saint Stephen and other kings in speeches, implying that the government is the heir to Hungary's crown. And this might be too extreme, I think. This ideological farming would justify harsher measures as necessary to save the nation. So in dealing with civil society dissent, Prime Minister Corvinus would likely show less restraint than Orbán. When NGOs and activists protest, he might deploy stronger intimidation. For instance, using police raids and punitive audits against critical NGOs. Given his autocratic mindset, Corvinus could introduce national loyalty law, which is extreme, requiring the NGOs to register with the government council. And of course, punishing those who are receiving foreign funds, and all of this as agents of influence. This is familiar. Orbán's rhetoric in 2014 already framed independent activists as foreign agitators. And of course, Corvinus would reinforce this through laws and orchestrated smear campaigns. We might even imagine show trials in state media where certain activists are branded as traitors undermining Hungary's sovereignty, a modern echo of a king removing disloyal vassals. And we are getting to the migration crisis, which is my favorite. So Matthias Corvinus, as a 15th century king, won renown fighting the Ottoman expansion. So in 2015, facing mostly Muslim refugees, a modern Corvinus would almost certainly cast himself as the shield of Christendom. I think he would go so much harder than Orbán ever did. So Orbán's fence building and anti-migrant propaganda would be only the starting point. Matthias might mobilize the military to a greater extent, perhaps deploying army regiments to reinforce the border police or even countenancing more physical pushback than Orbán did. Well, of course, Orbán used tear gas and water cannons to stop the people crossing at Röszke. Can you imagine like Corvinus sitting as a prime minister and seeing the wave of Muslims coming towards his country? Like, he's sitting there and says like,
"Oh shit, here we go again."
For instance, when the EU proposed the refugee quota sharing, Orbán held a national referendum to reject it. So Corvinus might instead issue an outright decree refusing the EU resettlement plans, daring Brussels to sanction Hungary. So his calculus is true to Orbán's, we are just adding a monarchical boldness to it. And of course, Corvinus would push the same east-west balancing that Orbán pushed. Historically, Matthias negotiated between the Pope, the Holy Roman Empire and the Ottoman Empire to maximize Hungary's position. So I really do not see any reason why Corvinus would not strengthen the ties with Russia and China. He could accelerate deals like the Poksh 2 nuclear project with Moscow and sign onto China's Belt and Road infrastructure projects with enthusiasm, using these relationships as leverage against the EU pressure. So if the EU threatened funding cuts over his illiberal policies, Matthias might respond by securing loans or investments from the East, echoing how a king might seek a powerful patron or ally when excommunicated by the Pope, for example. He would project confidence that Hungary has other options, thereby blunting the EU leverage. At the same time, Corvinus might harness the Visegrad Group alliance more tightly. So the goal is to make the EU think twice before they are isolating Hungary completely. In essence, Corvinus would play great power politics from the Prime Minister's office, much as he did from the throne, building a bloc to counter larger Western European influence. What about the media, culture and education under Corvinus's third term? From 2014 to 2018, Orbán's circle had gained control or influence over most media. But Corvinus would be vigilant to snuff out any remaining independent voices. He might introduce a press regulation law to license journalists effectively, banning government critics from mainstream platforms. So you know what Corvinus would do? He would cultivate a cult of personality. While Orbán's image was really carefully managed, Corvinus could lean into hero worship. State media could restructure the folkloric image of Matthias the Just. Imagine news segments of Prime Minister Corvinus making surprise visits to a poor village to help citizens, create legend that the king walks among us. Such personal myth-building would tighten the emotional grip on the public. So in education, Orbán's government mandated a conservative curriculum. And here is Corvinus, a true Renaissance patron of learning, might reform curricula to extol Hungary's historical greatness. Naturally, including extensive chapters on the original King Matthias's glorious reign. Dissenting educators might find themselves replaced by loyal scholars of the realm. Matthias could also establish new elite schools or institutes named after Renaissance figures, tying intellectual prestige to his regime. Okay, we got this part done. Let's just see how the consolidation of power goes. With another supermajority in 2014, Orbán continued tweaking the constitution. Matthias would use every opportunity to fortify his near-absolute rule. This could include constitutional amendments to entrench Corvinus loyalists in key posts for the long term. Matthias might extend such terms to lifetime appointments. Effectively, noble titles for loyalists, ensuring his followers outlast any electoral setback. Might revive the old institution of palatine or viceroy. He could establish a new high office that acts with the prime minister's authority in the regions, possibly to bypass opposition local councils. All these moves would aim to make the governance structure so Corvinus-centric that removing him democratically would become almost impossible. By 2018, Hungary under Corvinus would be an even more consolidated illiberal democracy. One man's enlightened absolutism cloaked in the forms of 21st century state. And guess what? He's re-elected again. And we are getting to the fourth term where a lot of shit happened. Well, Orbán boosted the economy of Hungary until COVID hit. From there on, it's way down. After a decade in power, Orbán entered his new term, facing new challenges. Internal and external backsliding of Hungary's democratic decline had grown. Look, we can approach this from lots of perspectives, but I would not say that Hungary is not a democracy. This is just simply bullshit. Because you don't do what the EU says, it does not mean that you're not a democracy. Well, I know that when you entered the EU, you agreed to some terms, but what is too much, it's simply too much. So in 2018, the EU Parliament triggered the Article 7 process against Hungary, citing a systematic rule of law violation. Domestically, opposition parties, while weak, formed an unprecedented united force by 2021. Of course, for the upcoming elections. And during this term, an unforeseen crisis just hit, a global pandemic. So yeah, a lot of things happened here, and let's just see how Corvinus would do it. Well, there's a big chance that he would pursue the culmination of his autocratic projects, transforming Hungary into a state where his authority is unquestionable and permanent. Any remaining constraints or dissent would be dealt with decisively. So lots of critics say that Orbán was crafting an illiberal democracy, while Corvinus' Hungary by 2022 would be closer to an elective monarchy in all, but not name, of course, because you can't name it like this. So his approach to this term would be blend with opportunism and legacy building. And guess what? Corvinus would see the pandemic as a near explicit mandate to assume extraordinary powers. You could imagine that once Corvinus had sweeping emergency powers, he would not readily relinquish them. While Orbán allowed the first indefinite emergency to lapse after a few months, Corvinus might extend the state of emergency continuously, perhaps justifying it by other threats, migrants, national security, and things like this. He would release the freedom to rule unencumbered, issuing decrees to override laws, reassign budgets, and silence critics. Just as King Corvinus ruled by royal decree, Prime Minister Corvinus would rule by emergency edict. And of course, any protest about democratic backlashing would be met with an argument that extraordinary times require a strong hand. Moreover, Corvinus would use emergency powers to permanently reshape institutions. For example, he could issue decrees that install military officers, of course loyal to him, to run municipalities, or that strip opposition mayors of authority. So this pandemic would help Corvinus to accelerate the creation of the de facto one-man system. Corvinus would continue to entrench his regime's ideology and personnel. Corvinus would use his legislative supermajority to bake in features that safeguard his rule. One could envision an amendment where Hungary's historical heritage cannot be harmed. a vague clause that could be used at bar parties or movements that are violating Hungary's constitutional identity. He might also constitutionally mandate powerful new councils that can override government decisions, just to ensure that if by some chance he falls out of the prime minister chair, a fallback body under his influence still holds sway. So in short, Corvinus would hold multiple levers of control. Well, of course, seeing all the other parties uniting for the 22 elections may trigger a little bit of panic in Corvinus. Or maybe not, he would just laugh it off like, fucking peasants. And of course, Corvinus would flood the media with propaganda. And after that, he would resort to even higher tactics, having the state prosecutor initiating legal cases against the opposition party leaders. And this will drive to disqualify them or discredit them before the elections. 100% sure that, like in any Netflix movie, he would use surveillance for blackmail material, quietly leveraging his security forces to harass key opposition organizers. So yeah, Orbán gave 5 minutes for the opposition leader to speak on national TV. I think that this would not satisfy Corvinus. Well, I think that he could outright ban opposition rallies under pandemic rules. And we need to stop for a second here. In general, when you're doing things like this extreme and just looking at the Hungarian people and they are not stupid, here will be a civil war. I mean, this is just too extreme and a brutal civil war would happen. And I just do not want to go there in this video because I want him to complete all of the Orbán term, you know. We need to go until the 5th term, so this video is complete. So maybe a civil war would broken out in 2016-17, but not in this case, because I want to go until 2025. So let's just go on from here. So Matthias's mindset would be that of a wartime king facing rebels, no tactics is off the table to ensure victory. Gerrymandering might be intensified further. If opposition strongholds threatens Corvinus' seats, he could split those districts or change local election rules to dilute their vote. Ultimately, by 2022, Matthias would aim to make the consent of mere formality. And now we're getting to a point where it's really hard for me to remain logical, because I would like to talk about the international relations, but in a real world that would be diminished in his 3rd term or 2nd term, somewhere like that. So I think that he would be voted out of NATO and the EU way before, in a way. So yeah, it's kind of impossible, but so yeah, let's just continue in this setting that he's still in the EU and still in NATO, because they simply just cannot isolate him. So yeah, let's just see the international relations of this Corvinus-led Hungary. Oh my god, this is getting out of hands. really out of hands. So during this term, Orbán had to carefully manage his place in NATO and the EU, especially when the Ukrainian crisis erupted in 2022. As we all know, Ukraine got attacked by Russia. Orbán tried to straddle East and West. Well, of course, they were condemning Russia's actions in words and also opposing some anti-Russia measures. And he casted himself as the guarantor of Hungary's peace. Well, and I think that Corvinus, being a master of battle, but also in a modern setting, he might find this war a really delicate thing. So in one form, Corvinus fought the invaders of Europe. So we can imagine that he could view Putin's aggression dimly. And on the other hand, I think that he could see this situation really similarly as Orbán saw this back then. So in short, it's an official neutrality with a pro-Russian lean. So he could use the war to further his narrative of protection. So Corvinus would likely campaign as the peace and security candidate who keeps Hungary out of the conflict. I just simply think that his main focus would be on Hungary's sovereignty. And this is logical from the point of view where Hungary is standing in today's world. It's a 2,000-year-old country, bro. It's brutal. It was a really brutal term. He really managed the seek of full control. So yeah, let's just finish this off. And let's just go to the 5th term of Corvinus. He's elected again. I have no idea how. I have no idea how a civil war did not erupt. So yeah, he's an autocrat in the EU. This is clear as the sky. And his focus would be on keeping this status maintained. So Corvinus, as a legendary military figure reborn, might initially be torn between opposing an aggressor and seizing an opportunity to assert neutrality. However, given his earlier alignments with illiberal powers and disdain of Brussels, he might follow Orbán's path in proclaimed neutrality. Of course, he would be refusing to let either East or West to dictate Hungary's stance. Unlike Orbán, he would block, or at least try to slow down, sanctions that hurts Hungary's energy supply. And I think that this is the only logical path that he can take in a modern world. I mean, you don't really want to go to war against anybody these days, especially if you are Hungary. You are way past your prime as a country, sadly, of course. But you just simply can't go to war, and you still need to have a plan B if you are casted out from the EU. So I really see logic in these actions. I think that these are the only logical things that he could do. And of course, in 2025, the EU would grow even more impatient with Corvinus's autocratic style. So it's time for them to get rid of him. So Corvinus might calculate what he can do without EU money if he secures alternate revenue. So to that end, he would deeply partnership with China, perhaps finalizing major loans for infrastructure like high-speed rail using Hungary's strategic location as bait. And the Middle East seek investments from Gulf states or cheap energy deals. Just as King Corvinus sought diverse revenue, to not rely solely on the nobles. If EU funds remain frozen, he could present it as liberation from Brussels' financial blackmail. In domestic propaganda, EU institutions would be vilified more than ever, depicted as colonial overlords, punishing Hungary for defending its values. Corvinus might even orchestrate a national consultation or referendum, asking Hungarians if they support his government's fight against the EU, expecting an affirmative that he can brandish as a democratic mandate to continue his course. So yeah, Corvinus could subtly threaten a Huxit to spook the EU, all while maintaining it's not our desire but we demand respect. Essentially, Corvinus would leverage every tool to ensure Hungary's sovereignty is unbowed, even if that meant worsening relations. His diplomatic style would be reminiscent how he dealt with the Pope and the Roman Empire in his day. Outwardly respectful, but always ready to defy or deceive if it meant Hungary's independence. Let's see his economic policy in his last term. And we're really getting to the end of this video, so I'm so glad that I managed to make this shit. So let's see his economic policies in his last term. So facing inflation and economic strain, Corvinus would likely continue populist economic measures, but of course with a more autocratic twist. Price controls, wage hikes, and tax cuts targeted to loyal demographics. Now these things would be utilized generously. However, if these strains persisted, Corvinus would cast more furiously the blame on scapegoats, like Brussels sanctions, foreign speculators, or even internal saboteurs. So Orbán's government sometimes blames local opposition-led city councils for economic woes. Corvinus might escalate that by placing major sectors under state of emergency control. So his administration would continue heavy favoritism towards loyalist businesses, essentially court of economy of cornies. But Matthias might also punish profiteering publicly to maintain his just image. And who knows how this would go on, because we do not know the future. Next year there will be some elections, the biggest one maybe, because the opposition has a real big chance of beating Orbán's Fidesz party. If we got the Corvinus, he would never change him. He would be ruling for 30 plus years, or until he dies, but he would make sure that power lands in good hands. So yeah,
3 months, 4 months completing this shit. Yeah, no words. I can go to sleep now.